Our next lesson involves learning how to multiply and divide integers, both positives and negatives, but using models and number lines. In class, we talked about those two color counters and that the yellow side represents positive and the red side represents a negative number. And we have one counter, of course, to represent each number. So what happens is when we start working with these integers, you're going to see a problem that is written like a normal multiplication or division problem, and you're going to have to solve it. You've seen problems like this first one your entire life. 3 groups of positive 3 is how you would read this. The division sign really the multiplication sign really means groups of. So this would be 3 groups of 3. So you can see here we have 3 groups of counters. There's 1, 2, 3 groups of counters. Each group is in a straight line or in a straight row, however you prefer to look at it. And there are 3 positives in each group. So we end up with a finalized result of 9, positive 9. And if we wanted to look at it at the number line, we would start at 0. And as usual, we would count. We're going to the positive side because it's positive 3, which is going to result in a positive 9. So we take large jumps as though we were skip counting positive 3s, just like you did when you were in elementary school. So 3, 6, 9 is how we would show this on a number line. The second problem here is a little different because we now have a negative value. So we're going to have 3 groups of negative 3. So our model looks different in that now our counters are red, but we have those 3 groups still. There's 3 inside each group, and so if you were to count these up, we have a total of negative 9. So on that number line this time, because we are working with negatives, we have to move to the left, to the negative side. And we're going to skip count by 3s here. So 3, negative 3, negative 6, negative 9. It works the same way, just on the opposite side of the number line. Now, lastly, and this is the most complex one that we are going to work with, is we're going to have right here, if you look, our first factor is a negative 3. Well, this first factor is the one that tells us how many groups we're making. When we talked about this before, how you cannot have even 0 groups of something. If you have one item, one highlighter, one dry erase marker, you still have a group. It's one group. You cannot have less than one group of anything. So we can't have a negative number of groups. So what happens is we have to take this negative sign and we have to apply it to the second factor. So instead of saying negative 3 groups, we're going to come back to the concept of the opposite. We're actually going to have 3 groups of the opposite of negative 3. And you guys know that the opposite of negative 3 would be a positive 3. So that's why we have in each of our 3 groups, we have the opposite of negative 3, which would be a positive 3. And that results in the answer of a positive 9. 3 times 3 is 9. So again, we would just start at the 0 and we skip count 3, 6, 9 on the number line. Let's look at a couple of more. We now need to find 4 groups of negative 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw my model. I'm going to make 4 groups of negative 2. I'm going to use red because my second factor is this negative 2. So I'm using red to represent the negative integers. And I'm going to have 4 groups that have negative 2 in each. So I'm going to go 1, 2. There's 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups. And you can see the resulting answer would be a negative 8. So then on the number line, I'm going to skip count by negative 2's because that's how many are inside each group. I want to skip count by what is in the group, not the number of groups. So I would start at the 0, and I'm going to skip count by -2. So -2, -4, -6, -8. So each group has -2, so each jump on my number line also has -2. Let's look at the next problem. And it says 2 groups of +4. So now this time I'm making 2 groups, so I'm going to have 2 columns, and inside each column would be a +4. So I'm going to use yellow to represent that. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And when we count these up, we see that that results in 8. You've solved these kinds of problems every time. 2 groups of +4. So when I start on my number line, I'm going to have 2 jumps, but each jump is going to contain 4 intervals on the number line. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I end up at the +8. Now we come to one of these tricky ones. We cannot have a negative amount of groups. It's not possible. So that means that we need 2 groups of the opposite of -4. The opposite of -4 would be a +4. So I'm going to need my yellows, and I'm going to make 2 groups of those yellows. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we wind up with +8. And so my skip counting is going to look the same. 4, 8. We end up with a +8. Division is similar. What happens with division, though, is we are taking that whole set and we are dividing it into groups. So we have 9 into 3 groups. So this division sign is your into, and this time our groups are the second number. The second, it's our our divisor, what we're divising by. 9 is our dividend, 3 is our divisor. So if you have 9, it's a +9 because there's no sign in front of it, and we make it into 3 groups. You can see here where there's one group already for you, and then I'm going to add another group, 2, 3 groups, and in each group we have 3, so our resulting answer is 3. The second problem, we've got -8 into 4 groups. And so all we're doing is we're taking those red counters and we are dividing it into those 4 groups. And inside each group, you see we have a -2. Now, this is the tricky part. This would be this second number in our problem. Our divisor tells us how many groups. It is impossible to have a negative amount of groups. So what we have to do is apply that negative sign to our dividend, the number that we are dividing up into groups, the number we're making into groups. So it has to be the opposite of 9 into 3 groups, where the opposite of +9 is -9. And we're going to divide them into 3 groups. 1 group, 2 group, 3 groups. And inside each group, this time we have a -3. Here, again, we cannot have a negative amount of groups. So we have to apply this negative sign to our dividend. So we need to find the opposite of -8 into 4 groups. So here I have my 8 yellow counters, and I'm going to divide them into 4 groups, and we end up with a +2 counters. These are yellow, which means they're positive. So negative 8 divided by negative 4 gives us 2.